The old interview clip starts softly. "Everything you've lived through made you who you are today," the host says. Gladys Knight smiles, measured, guarded. She talks about some people who were just friends, people who knew her for a long time, how they all kind of grew together. Off minus camera, someone mentions a man who had that music right here and right here, pointing to the head, then the heart. What never gets mentioned in that moment is the cost. Gladys Knight's real tragedy wasn't something the public ever saw under stage lights. It unfolded quietly, off stage, while her voice was at its strongest. Years vanished from her career with no clear explanation. Records were delayed. Opportunities that should have been automatic never even reached her. She was told to wait while someone else was pushed ahead. That kind of loss doesn't soften with time. Repulsive, yes. For decades, Gladys Knight refused to praise the man at the center of that story. No thanks, no warm anecdotes, no forgiveness. The silence around him was intentional. And those who knew her understood that the feeling behind it was not mild resentment. It was something colder, deeper, and permanent. So who was the one man Gladys Knight came to hate more than anyone else? What did he do that cost her something she could never get back? And why has the truth about his decisions stayed buried for so long? This is the story of the man she never forgave, and the secret Motown had every reason to keep quiet. Chapter 1: When Hatred Was Born from Dismissal, 1959. It didn't start with an argument. It started with a date on a calendar. January 1959. Detroit was buried under winter. Motown was still a cramped operation, not yet the polished empire the world would later celebrate. Decisions were made in small rooms by a handful of men who believed they were designing the future of black music. One day that winter, a closed-door meeting was scheduled inside the building. The agenda was simple but enormous: decide who would become Motown's primary female star. One woman to be presented to America as the label's centerpiece. Gladys Knight was already inside those walls. At 24, she was not some untested teenager. She had been singing since childhood, winning talent shows, performing with a discipline drilled into her by church and family. By 1959, her voice was fully formed, powerful yet controlled, grounded and mature. It didn't sound promising. It sounded finished. According to accounts repeated years later by producers, background singers, and executives who claimed to have been there or heard what followed, that was exactly the problem. Gladys wasn't even called into audition for that meeting. She didn't have to. Everyone already knew what she could do. The conversation behind those doors wasn't about whether she could sing. It was about how she could be used. Berry Gordy sat at the center of that discussion. Motown needed a woman who could be introduced as the face of the label, someone who could move easily into television, magazines, mainstream white audiences, someone who could be shaped, groomed, and packaged from the ground up. In that room, Gladys Knight was quietly judged as to complete. The decision was never delivered to her directly. No one called her into an office to say she'd been passed over. Instead, she was handed the line every artist hears when the truth would be too cruel. Wait, be patient. Your time is coming. There was no schedule attached, no plan, just soothing words with nothing under them. That was the first cut. Spring 1959 arrived. Other acts started getting the label's full attention. Studio time opened up for them. Marketing budgets shifted in their direction. Gladys Knight, the Pips kept recording, but their releases slowed. Tracks were held. Promotion stayed minimal. Nothing was said outright. Everything was implied. By around May 1959, Gladys began to see the pattern. Not through confrontation, but through absence. Meetings she should have been in happened without her. Decisions about her music were made with no one asking her opinion. Singles by other artists rushed to radio while her songs sat on the shelf. Whenever she asked why, the answers were always the same. Soon. Not yet. Timing. Patience slowly turned into humiliation. What hurt was just losing a spotlight. What hurt was being kept close enough to hope. She was dropped from the label. She was encouraged to move on. She was kept in place working, waiting, while her prime years began to slip away. Behind the scenes, insiders later described Berry Gordy as thinking he respected Gladys's voice. That was never in doubt. But it was said that he viewed her as too strong, too self-possessed, too grounded in who she already was to be molded into the kind of controlled image he wanted for Motown's first great female symbol. She didn't need to be rescued. She didn't look to anyone for permission. And in a system built on control, that made her risk. By late summer 1959, the emotional damage was obvious to those closest to her. Gladys became quieter in label meetings. The questions stopped. She no longer asked when her moment was coming. She simply watched. She watched how Berry Gordy spoke to other women on the roster, how encouragement flowed in certain directions and never quite reached her. She saw the warmth he extended to the artists he favored, and the cool, professional distance he kept with her. The realization was both devastating and clarifying. This wasn't about vocal ability. It was about power, and who got to be shaped and by whom. The detail that still stings, repeated by people close to Gladys, is simple. Berry Gordy never gave her the honesty she was owed. He never told her she didn't fit his vision. He never admitted he preferred someone else for the crown. He simply left her in limbo, knowing a singer's best years don't last forever. That's where hatred took root. Not the loud kind that explodes in public. A slow, internal hatred that eats away, quietly born when a person understands they are being diminished deliberately, unpolitely at the same time. By December 1959, Gladys Knight was no longer emotionally invested in Motown as a true home. She still showed up. She still recorded. But something fundamental had snapped. The trust was gone. The respect had fractured. She understood something crucial before the decade ended. Berry Gordy had looked straight at her undeniable talent and decided she was not worth centering, not because she lacked greatness, but because she could not be controlled the way he preferred. And instead of setting her free, he chose to keep her waiting. That choice cost her years she would never get back. Every delayed release, every missed chance, every moment watching others rise while she stood still traced back to that winter meeting in Detroit, to that silence, to that decision that no one had the courage to say aloud. In Gladys Knight's memory, this wasn't just a professional disappointment. It was an insult to her dignity, a quiet message that her value inside Motown would always be conditional. Hatred born like that doesn't burn out quickly. It settles in. It remembers dates, rooms, conversations that never happened. It remembers who stayed silent when the truth could have changed everything. That was how it began. Not with scandal, not with shouting, but with a meeting in 1959, a promise with no intention behind it, and a career placed on hold by a man who never once explained why. This was the moment Gladys Knight stopped believing in Berry Gordy, and everything that followed grew from that single, unforgiven silence. Chapter 2: Hated for being turned into a backup plan. 1963-1966. The damage from 1959 didn't disappear. It went underground. By the spring of 1963, Motown was no longer a small Detroit hustle. It was evolving into a machine. Television appearances were mapped out months ahead. Image consultants were being hired. Photo shoots, choreography, press strategy, everything was suddenly about visibility, marketability, and control. Inside that rapidly tightening system, one woman was being lifted at full speed while another was being quietly restrained. In April 1963, Diana Ross and the Supremes appeared on national television for the first time. The reaction was instant. Phones rang. Bookings increased. America reacted exactly the way Motown hoped it would. Executives noticed. Berry Gordy noticed more than anyone. According to people who later spoke about those days, he saw in Diana Ross someone he could turn into a symbol, a carefully built face of the label. From that moment, the center of gravity shifted. Tours expanded. Media bookings multiplied. Budgets opened. Diana Ross was positioned anywhere a camera might land. Gladys Knight watched it all in real time. At the same moment that Diana Starr was being engineered for ascension, Gladys Knight and the Pips already had something most acts were still chasing: a proven audience. Their records were selling. Their shows were tight. Promoters trusted them. Radio responded when they were played. On paper, there was no logical reason to slow them down. But that is exactly what began to happen. In June 1963, a single scheduled for release by Gladys Knight and the Pips was quietly delayed. No memo circulated. No explanation was offered. The record simply didn't come out when it was supposed to. When questions were asked, the answers were the same script she had heard before. The label is restructuring. The timing isn't quite right. Just be patient. Behind the scenes, something more specific was unfolding. According to longtime Motown insiders who later spoke under the protection of anonymity, Berry Gordy had made a strategic decision. He didn't want a dominant female act fighting for the same spotlight. The empire, in his mind, needed a single queen, one face, one narrative, one woman the public would associate with the label's success. Diana Ross was chosen to be that face. Gladys Knight was not thrown out, she was part. The difference mattered. If she had been dropped, she could have pursued another path early. Instead, she was held in place, still under contract, still recording, still touring but in smaller spots, on tighter budgets, with fewer resources. She was kept close enough to be useful, far enough from the center to be controlled. Chapter 3: Hatred Born When Power Became Intimate, 1960 for 1968. By late 1964, the imbalance inside Motown wasn't subtle anymore. It was personal. In November of that year, people inside the building noticed a shift that couldn't be explained by charts alone. Diana Ross was no longer simply the lead singer of the Supremes. She was becoming the emotional center of Berry Gordy's world. Meetings changed tone when her name came up. Decisions bent in her direction. Schedules and sessions were reshuffled to accommodate her. This was rumor invented long after the fact. Staff members saw it. Executives who once debated strategy freely now deferred, almost automatically whenever Gordy spoke about Diana. Producers adjusted their calendars. Writers reworked songs. Future projects were quietly restructured around wherever she fit. The line between professional judgment and personal attachment had blurred. Then, it disappeared. Gladys Knight saw it before anyone was ready to say it out loud. She noticed how Diana's songs were approved with almost no resistance, while her own were subjected to extra scrutiny. She noticed how Diana's mistakes were treated as growth, while her missteps were marked as risk. She noticed how one woman was shielded from consequence, while another was expected to endure indefinitely. By early 1965, the rumor was no longer confined to hallways. It was widely believed among insiders that Berry Gordy and Diana Ross were involved emotionally, not casually, but deeply. And once that became clear, everything else made more sense. Motown was no longer just a label making cold business decisions. It was a kingdom being steered through one man's private lens. And that lens determined whose career got oxygen and whose career stayed under glass. For Gladys Knight, this understanding was devastating. Up to that point, she had tried to believe her stalled momentum came down to branding, marketing, strategy painful, but at least logical. Once she understood that intimacy, not merit, had tilted the playing field, the hurt shifted into something darker. Her life's work was being weighed against someone else's private relationship, a contest she was never even allowed to enter. By March 1965, Diana Ross was being quietly prepared for something unprecedented. Gordy began discussing her solo future in closed, minus-door conversations. The Supremes were still active, but the long minus-term trajectory was already being redrawn with her at the center. Diana was being groomed not just as a singer, but as a symbol and extension of Gordy's own story, his taste, his legacy. Meanwhile, Gladys Knight and the Pips were still being restrained. Tour schedules for mid-1965 showed a consistent pattern. Diana headlined, Gladys opened. In some cities, audiences responded more explosively to Gladys. The applause was louder, the connection was deeper, and still nothing changed. No promotion bump, no recalculated strategy, no serious move to raise her to the level she had already proven she could hold. This was the line Gladys crossed internally. She stopped seeing herself as collateral damage of business. She started seeing herself as a casualty of desire. And that to her was unforgivable. Her anger was not aimed at Diana Ross personally. What enraged her was the corruption of authority. The idea that one man's private feelings could quietly determine who soared and who sat in place. She understood something most artists are never willing to say plainly. A powerful man had fallen in love. And instead of protecting the structure he built, he allowed that love to seep into it, reshape it, and damage everyone who didn't benefit from it. By late 1965, Gladys stopped pretending otherwise. People close to her say this is when her demeanor changed for good. In meetings, she went colder. The eager questions disappeared. She stopped submitting extra ideas, stopped looking for validation. She did the work. Nothing more. It rust apathy. It was armor. Behind the scenes, her conversations became sharper. She started asking why opportunities weren't distributed according to performance. Why some voices at the label were treated as expendable while others were untouchable. No one gave her a straight answer. No one denied what she already knew either. By 1966, Berry Gordy's emotional investment in Diana Ross was an open secret within Motown, and with that knowledge came a terrifying clarity. There was no real path forward for Gladys Knight inside that structure. She was not competing against another artist anymore. She was competing against intimacy. And intimacy always wins in a system built around one man's will. What made the situation morally unbearable to Gladys was jealousy. It was the hypocrisy. Motown sold itself to the world as a merit-based institution, a place where black talent finally received fair opportunity and reward. But behind that glossy story was a private reality, one man's personal attachment, quietly steering an empire. Gladys took that as a violation of principle. She believed in work, discipline, and earned respect. The idea that her career could be slowed not because she wasn't great enough, but because she was adored by the right man, cut deeper than any bad review ever could. By early 1967, the emotional distance between Gladys and Berry Gordy was complete. They still shared buildings, contracts, stages, and logos. But there was no trust left, just formalities. Names on paper. Polite interactions covering a wound that never closed. Underneath that politeness was hatred. Not wild, dramatic hatred. A controlled, disciplined hatred that remembers quietly. Never lets go. Gladys never stormed into Gordy's office to confront him about his relationship with Diana Ross. She chose something more final. She checked out of Motown in her mind long before her body and her signature left the premises. From that moment on, every delayed record had a face behind it. Every missed opportunity had an explanation. Every pleasant dismissal was decoded and traced back to one truth: the power at the top had been compromised. By 1968, the future was obvious. Diana Ross was being sculpted into a solo icon. Berry Gordy's devotion to her career was complete. Gladys Knight now knew with absolute certainty she would never be the priority here, not because she lacked genius, but because she was not loved. That realization didn't break her. It hardened her. It turned resentment into resolve. It taught her something brutal about how power can't twist systems and lives. To Gladys Knight, this was no longer just professional betrayal. It was moral decay. And hatred born from moral decay doesn't fade. It waits. It sharpens. It remembers every date, every meeting, every smile that hid a lie. Chapter for hatred deepens when you're held back on purpose. 1968, 1972. By the summer of 1968, Gladys Knight was done believing in misunderstandings. She no longer thought she was waiting for her moment. She knew she was being kept from it. On June 3, 1968, Detroit was heavy with heat and tension when Gladys asked for a private meeting with Berry Gordy. It was after another long rehearsal day at Motown headquarters, one of those days where her voice filled the room, where musicians nodded with quiet respect, where everyone could tell she had already outgrown the material being handed to her. She didn't come in angry. She didn't slam doors. She didn't deliver ultimatums. She asked for something basic, almost modest: the right to choose her own songs. She laid it out clearly. The tracks Motown was assigning her no longer sat right in her range. The keys felt wrong. The lyrics sounded too young for the woman she had become. On the road, night after night, crowds reacted the strongest when she sang heavier songs, grown material, lived minus and stories, music that carried the weight of real experience. She told Gordy she wasn't asking to run the label. She was asking to be trusted as an artist who knew her own voice better than any committee ever could. Berry Gordy listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. When she finished, the room went quiet. Then came the sentence that would replay in her head for the rest of her life. Wait your turn. Not an explanation. Not a plan. Just a dismissal disguised as patience. The meeting ended right there. Gladys walked out already knowing what that phrase really meant. There was no turn coming. There never had been. By that point, Diana Ross was already being positioned everywhere: TV, film conversations, magazine covers. Motown's future had been chosen, and it was singular. Behind closed doors, insiders later whispered the strategy that Gladys had already felt in her bones. Berry Gordy didn't want the powerful female voices fighting for the top spot. One would be pushed forward, the other would be held in reserve. Gladys Knight wasn't blocked because she wasn't good enough. That was the cruelty. She was contained precisely because she was too strong, too reliable, too capable of disrupting the narrative Motown wanted to sell. So she was kept on the road, kept recording safe songs, kept profitable, and kept beneath a ceiling she was never supposed to break. That June meeting wasn't a blowout argument. It was confirmation. She saw it clearly now. She was not being developed. She was being managed, not elevated, preserved, not championed, used as a backup plan. From then on, every wait sounded like stay in place. People who were in the building that day remember the meeting as short, polite, quiet. Gordy nodded, listened, and ended it with the same 3 words: wait your turn. On paper, it was harmless, temporary. In reality, it was final. Gladys had already been waiting nearly a decade. Over the next 4 years, the truth stopped being theoretical. It played out in real time. Album after album, Gladys Knight and the Pips were assigned songs chosen by committee, delayed without warning, or shelved entirely. Songs that audiences loved in concert were skipped over. Tracks that could have crossed genres were never pushed. Meanwhile, in January 1970, Diana Ross launched her solo career with unprecedented backing, creative freedom, and attention. Motown's machine moved at full power behind her. Gladys watched every step. Tour records from 1916 showed her consistently outperforming expectations in city after city, especially in the Midwest and the South. Promoters wanted her back. DJs wanted more of her records. A demand was there. Motown's response was silence. No bigger budgets. No expanded promotion. No real loosening of control. This was neglect. It was design. Industry insiders later described Motown's treatment of Gladys during this time with one word: containment. She was too valuable to lose, too dangerous to fully unleash. If she left, she could compete. If she stayed, she could be controlled. So she stayed, and that was the trap. By March 1970, Gladys shifted the question she was asking. She stopped talking about songs and started asking about contracts, release clauses, time limits, how long a label could keep an artist legally tied down without actually advancing their career. The answers were always foggy. We'll revisit that soon. The lawyers are still reviewing. We're working on it. Each vague response bought the label more time. Every delay strengthened Gordy's leverage. What made this period almost unbearable was the psychological precision of it. She was not openly rejected. She was not set free. She was suspended, required to smile, perform, deliver, all while knowing the system had quietly decided how far she was allowed to go. Friends later said this was when she began using one word over and over: trapped. By late 1970, her frustration was no longer just emotional. It showed up physically: exhaustion, insomnia, periods where she withdrew just to protect what was left of her energy. Not because she doubted her talent, but because she understood the game she was in. The system was built to wear her down until resistance felt impossible. This was control without change, the quiet violence of a stalled career. In 1971, Gladys made one last attempt to bargain from inside. She offered a compromise: give her or creative input and she would remain loyal to the label. Let her shape the work and she would stay in place. Gordy declined, politely, calmly, again without a real reason, again with the same message underneath: wait your turn. By then, the phrase was no longer advice. It was an insult, because Gladys now understood exactly what waiting meant in Motown language. It meant aging out, being replaced, losing momentum, while someone else remained protected. This was the point where hatred hardened into something colder. She no longer believed Gordy was indecisive. She believed he was intentional. Holding her back was a side effect. It was strategy. If Diana Ross ever faltered, Gladys could be elevated. Until then, she would remain in a holding pattern. To Gladys Knight, that was business. That was captivity. By the end of 1972, her choice was made, not loudly, not publicly, but firmly. She would leave Motown, even if it meant legal fights, even if it meant starting over, even if it meant burning bridges that would never be rebuilt, because staying meant accepting a slow erasure. And Gladys Knight refused to disappear politely. This chapter didn't end with a screaming match. It ended when she stopped believing patience was anything but a